Chris Lee and Blake Lovell of Southeastern 14 here. If you're wondering, my background is different. I'm coming to you from the heart of Pac 12, or what's left of the Pac 12
Boy.
slash Mountain West country out in the Denver, Colorado area. But football never stops. We never stop except for heart surgery. And so we are going to start bringing you SEC schedule previews. And Blake, you've heard of the most interesting man in the world. This might be the most interesting college football schedule in the world. Who put this thing together for Arkansas?
Yeah, no, we starting with Arkansas here, and obviously we have a lot of Arkansas fans who followed our stuff since we started. But we honestly, we just we did this at random, and we're just like, all right, let's start with this, and full disclosure, like I haven't necessarily kind of looked at all the schedules yet, but as you and I were talking, this has to be one of the toughest. It has to be one of the toughest schedules when you look up and down this thing. Um, Man, it is it is something, when you really look at it, because I think there's pretty much a storyline in every single game, but it's really about the overall schedule itself, right? And that's what we're gonna do. So keep that in mind. We're not necessarily gonna go game by game here and say Arkansas is gonna win this. We got that coming for you in about 3 weeks, when we go through and make our predictions for pretty much every SEC game, for every SEC team. We're gonna do that for every one of them. But this is more about, okay, how does the schedule unfold? How's it going to play out? And like you just said, Chris, this schedule is wild because they don't
It
play a road
really
game
is.
until what, 1st of October. And we're going to pull this up real quick because I think this is a very fascinating kind of thing to look at here. Because you kind of look at this, and this is a schedule that I mean it is one that you look at, and like we're sitting here thinking about it, and we're just like, the road game situation, they only play 4 all year, but every team they play, like, there's a fascinating storyline seemingly
Mhm.
involved, and of course, that goes for the SEC games too, so
Well, let me hit the highlights and maybe the lowlights, depending on your point of view. I don't know that there's any lowlights, but maybe where it gets easier. I would say on the bright side for Arkansas, 4 true road games, because that game with A&M is in Arlington, which is technically a neutral site. So really only 3 SEC road games. Of course, you're going, well, how did they get to another one? That's at BYU. We'll get to that one in a bit. And it gets easier in the second half, but that's relative. I mean, I still wouldn't want to play that schedule. Now, on the other side, my goodness, Blake, you've got 8 or 9 teams that could conceivably be in the top 25. You've got a very interesting FCS game. We'll get to that later. I mean, I don't know if this is the toughest schedule in the country, but it's got to be top 5, right?
it's a pretty tough schedule, yeah, and I mean, look, we start at the top, and I think that's where, things are pretty interesting here because you look at this slate, that we have pulled up here. I mean, you start with Cincinnati, who, as we know, get to the playoff line. It's gonna look a little different. If you haven't looked at Cincinnati yet, they're not gonna be necessarily the same team they were last year, but they're still gonna be pretty good. I would still expect them to be, what was it? I think Athlon's got them 15. Some of the other places, they're still gonna be a top 25 team. But it's just, I don't think your expectation is gonna be a playoff, right? So I think
Yeah.
that's a little bit different. But
Well, you want to catch them opening week in
right,
your
because
building
they're, yeah,
because they're reloading with so many key players. But
yeah,
I'm keeping an average of where these teams are rated for the magazines and the online things that I see coming out right now. Cincinnati's 19th in the country
yeah.
according to the average of what I have. So, but again, that's when you want to catch them. South Carolina is the next week. Carolina, a team that ended last year on a tear. Again, you're happy to get that one in Fayetteville. That's the dreaded 11 a.m. kickoff, though. So
And then what happens? And then you get a
we get a
familiar
motorcycle caravan
face.
coming into town.
A familiar face returns, and yeah, Bobby Petrino and the Missouri State squad makes their way in. That's always interesting, and it's good to know that's family weekend as well.
Right.
So good to know.
There's a comment there. We will not make it.
It's
Um,
good to know. But
but
yeah,
by
I
the
mean,
by the way, in all jokes aside, Missouri State, I've looked at 2 preseason FCS top 25s. They're 5th in one and 6th in the other. That team was
yeah.
8-4 a year ago, finished 103rd in the Sagarin, just for comparison's sake of how last year went. But mean, you
Yeah.
see FCS upsets every year. I don't think that's one we're going to pick, but that's not an easy layup game for the Razorbacks.
No, and that's I think we're going to say that about every game on their schedule because I think that's the biggest common denominator is I don't think you look at this entire schedule. Again, you expect them to beat Missouri State. You know, you expect them to win some of these SEC games, and they will. But it's just if you're actually looking across the board, which people joke about sometimes, we know with some of the SEC teams, they'll schedule games that there's just absolutely zero chance that there's going to be a loss there. You don't see that on this schedule. But again, that's not to say that Arkansas is going to lose every game or anything, but it's just there are no just complete gimmies. You're just going to show up and beat somebody 65 to nothing, right? And I think that to me is kind of the difference here. But then after that, okay, this is where, like I said, this is where the schedule gets interesting because October 8th is their first road game, and that's at Mississippi State, which I mean, let's be honest. Arkansas is a better team than Mississippi State. I think we can all, at least on paper, one of the season, they should be better than Mississippi State. Um, but that's an interesting stretch because if you start those first five games, Cincinnati, South Carolina, Missouri State, you got A&M and Arlington, and then you've got Alabama at home. I think you're looking at that stretch and thinking, all right, we should at worst probably be 3-2 would be kind of what I'm thinking, right? Because you feel like you should win those first three. But again, South Carolina, as we said, is they're heading in the right direction for sure. A&M, Alabama are going to be tough, but they're not completely. Look, you'd rather play Alabama and Fayetteville than Tuscaloosa, right?
Well, let
So
me give you the good news scenario. Not that there really is one for that 3-game stretch. Arkansas beat Mississippi State last year.
yeah,
It beat A&M last year, and it played Alabama within a touchdown. Now, look, I think if you win 1 of 3, you're probably happy. If you win 2 or 3 of those, you're elated.
yeah,
Especially if you have done well on the first 3 and say gone 3-0. But
yeah,
yeah, I mean that's a brutal and then you go to BYU. I don't know
yeah.
how often BYU loses in that building, but again, that's another team that is borderline preseason top 25, as is Mississippi State,
Two
according to some
high-powered
people.
offenses too. Two teams that are going to be based around. You know what you're getting offensively for them, and they're not going to be easy to game plan against. I think.
Yeah,
So
so here they are heading into the off week, which is October the 22nd. They'll have played 6 games. And I mean, there's really not a layup in there. I mean, the easiest game in there is Missouri State. But again, we've talked about that. That is not your slam dunk, guaranteed win FCS school, plus the history.
yeah. So I mean, and then what, right? It's like you said, you go into and then you got Auburn on the road, which again,
Yeah.
I think Arkansas on paper now, a lot of people would expect Arkansas to be better than Auburn, but it's a road game in the SEC, and we always say that. That's where things get interesting. And then if we go on down here, you wrap up your final portion, third of the schedule here, where you've got Liberty, which once again we know there's a common theme there. They're going to have some rebuilding to do. This is not going to be the team necessarily that has Malik Willis running the show, right? So there's going to be some changes there, and I think by that point in the season, they will have tried to figure some things out offensively, and I mean that to me is like a common theme with a lot of these teams. Like you look at some of the offenses and the different game planning and schemes you're going to have to prepare for. That's where I think the schedule gets very interesting because there's a lot of different ones on here like this. Um, just because the coach is on the other side, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's where this is pretty fascinating. Now, to me, I'll tell you, and we talked about the first part of the schedule, but I think those last 3 games to me are very interesting because, I mean, really, like that's where I don't have a great feel right now of what to make of LSU, Ole Miss, or
Yeah.
Missouri. And I think that's where by that point in the season, we're doing this in early July. We don't know where any of those teams are going to be at in late November. But as of right now, like I don't have a great feel for any of those 3 right there.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. By the way, I aired earlier. Actually, they've got 7 games before the bye week instead of 6.
Yeah.
But you pick up, sometimes it's not, and I'll give you an example from last year. Tennessee was better than Florida by season's end, but they played early in the year when Florida was still pretty good and had something to play for, and Florida won that game pretty decisively. I look at some of these games, and we said, the good thing about getting Cincinnati is probably when you get Cincinnati. when it
Yeah.
is replacing a bunch of key players. Liberty, you'd probably rather that game be in September
Yeah.
after replacing Malik Willis. LSU, you'd probably rather get that early in the year. I don't know how settled LSU will be with quarterback. Now, I guess one positive maybe is LSU's got some offensive line issues. And so maybe if depth is taken a toll by that part of the season, maybe. But I would rather get Brian Kelly when he's just a little further along a few games in the rebuilding process rather than the middle of November when they get them. Same with Ole Miss. Ole Miss replacing a quarterback. So you get them
Yeah.
when they're used to that. Now, and Auburn, I would like to have that game a little bit later. That one's interesting because Auburn is probably one of the more variable teams in the league year in and year out. And a lot of that is just what are they playing for? Like it implodes quickly at Auburn. And it started to implode in the offseason. You thought there was going to be a coaching change. So, like, Auburn, when Auburn has something to play for, again, that's a borderline top 25 team, maybe one that's there. But if it gets into the season, and you look at Auburn's schedule, Penn State, Missouri, LSU, at Georgia, at Ole Miss, then they get a bye week, which coincidentally the same week that Arkansas has its. So if that part of the schedule decimates Auburn, and there's talk of firing the coach and all sorts of things, you could see that go downhill pretty quickly. On the other hand, they win a couple of those games. It's looking good for Brian Harsin. Completely different game there, especially on the road. So I think the
Yeah.
order there in those last 5 games to me is kind of interesting. And frankly, again, I would prefer to have some of those games earlier in the season than later, but you play the hand you're dealt.
Well, you bring up a good point too. I think we always have to remember when we're breaking down schedules is it's not always about how your schedule falls. It's what is the opposition schedule situation, right? Like it's like, for example, all right, you play Alabama at home. Great. But when you really look at it, it's like, all right, you would love for Alabama to, play A&M or something the week before, right?
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, when you look at their schedule, they play Louisiana Monroe on September 17th, then they play Vanderbilt, those two games both at home, back to back. You feel like, they should take care of business handily in both of those games, you would expect, and then you go to Arkansas. So, but still, no matter what, like there's a lot of different those scenarios. Like Liberty, given their scheduling situation, like they're playing a lot of teams that, I think they're playing BYU, they're playing Virginia Tech. I think they've got maybe Wake Forest in there somewhere. But when you look at how the schedule falls, they get a bye week before they, play in Arkansas. So it's like those are things too. If you really try to study the schedule, a lot of it can come down to how does your schedule fall, but also when you're
Yep.
playing this opponent, right? Like it's what does their schedule look like the week before, or have they played 5 games in a row or 6 games in a row without a bye? We know those kind of things are big factors. Having that break to rest and heal and those kind of things. So I think that'll be something too that we kind of monitor as we go through all of these schedules in the SEC. So
Yeah, and this brings up a pet peeve. If you go 7-5 against this schedule, that's a really good year. To me, that's a top 25 season. You don't see the pollsters reward that a lot. You'll
yeah,
see a 9-3 team that, I'll pick on Kentucky here for a minute, that schedules 4 out of conference wins, maybe doesn't get the tough teams from the West, and everybody's looking at that record to the left of the dash. Arkansas, if it goes 8-4, will get this team in the top 25 at the end of the season, depending on what happens in the bowl game. 7-5 won't. I guess we'll talk about the end of the season before the bowl. 7-5 won't
yeah.
probably, and I think that'll, if this schedule is what we think it is, and that's what they do, I think that'll be unfair. But
Gonna be a it's going to be a challenge, but as we saw, Arkansas heading in the right direction for sure, based on last season, as you've got at the bottom there in the ticker. Just a lot of interesting games last year, and look, I mean, last year's schedule wasn't easy either, and in the SEC, it's only going to get tougher from here when we talk about all the teams that are going to be coming in with Texas and Oklahoma and
mm-hmm.
all those teams. So, yeah, it's your typical SEC schedule from a conference standpoint, but there's a lot of not, and we're not saying this in terms of, again, Arkansas should beat these teams they're playing in the non-conference, I think. But there's more interesting storylines attached to them than just your regular, everyone makes fun of the SEC in week whatever because everybody plays, teams that just have no chance whatsoever. But at least you've got some interesting storylines, and you have some teams that have had success. Obviously, we know Liberty's been able to accomplish. You talked about Missouri State situation, Cincinnati. Again, they're in the college football playoff last year. I don't think they'll be there this year, but there's just a lot of those kind of elements that really build this into a pretty fantastic schedule if you're looking at it from a strength standpoint. So,
Parting thoughts.
nope, we will have more of these coming. We will again just kind of do these at random and pick these out of a hat and go with the next one from here. So be sure to hit that subscribe button, and a lot more of these coming. We'll have our full breakdowns of each team's kind of season coming soon, and then as I teased as well, by the end of the month we'll do kind of our game by game predictions, and we'll add in a partner of ours as well to some of these videos and get him in the rotation here. And so yeah, a lot of fun stuff on the way. Hit that subscribe button.
He's Blake Lovell. I'm Chris Lee. Thanks for watching. Again, got another one of these coming very soon, so be sure to watch for that.